First of all, welcome everybody. I would like to introduce our distinguished guest in alphabetical order, just to be precise. Firstly, Sorab Amari, founder and editor of Compact magazine. After him, Mr. Rod Reher, senior editor of the American Conservative, our good and great friend. Then Colin Morrison, founder and publisher of the Flashes and Flames media company, which is covering topics on media from the UK. After that, our other great friend, Mr. Zoltán Szalai, editor-in-chief of Mandiner and director general at MCC. And then Javier Villamor, journalist from Spain, from 7NN. So our main topic is the revolutionaries in the media, and I will start the discussion with rather general questions. Firstly to Sorab, what do you think, what are the main dimensions of these changes? Because the media is changing at the moment. We have new platforms, new business models. What is changing? The publishers or the readers, or both?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's always good to be in Budapest, especially at MCC. Let me start by just saying how, after numerous interactions, I'm so pleased every time I interact with MCC students, their seriousness of purpose, their curiosity. And having flattered you, I just wondered if we could take 30 seconds, use your smartphones to go to compactmag.com and take out a subscription. I'll wait. No, I'm kidding. But there's a serious element to that joke, which is that you have a fracturing of the mainstream media market. I'm a refugee or an exile from newspapers. I spent a decade working for Rupert Murdoch's various publications, and I, like several other people, saw an opportunity in this fracturing, especially the opinion media market, which is what Compact is. Compact is an enterprise that publishes both short-form and longer-form essays. It has a worldview, bringing people from the left and the right together who are both critical of the neoliberal consensus that prevails in the West. And the fracturing of the media market is something that's happened as a result of, market forces and as a result of ideological forces. And I'll briefly outline those two, and that might suffice for my answer. And I don't know how much of this applies in a Hungarian of Central European context, but on the ideological side, I think we're familiar. The fact that the mainstream publications, especially progressive publications, center-left, have become ever more sort of dogmatic and orthodox, and that's made a lot of their journalists who used to be brand names have to part ways with them because they could no longer operate in that environment. That's a kind of obvious one I think you're familiar with. The more market-driven forces are the fact that the mainstream publications are grappling with a long-term decline in print ad revenue, advertising revenue, and they are more and more forced to use the subscription model to rely on subscription circulation, both print circulation to a lesser extent, but online circulation. But what that means is that they have to cater to the people who subscribe to them more and more, so that they lose their character as a national newspaper. The Washington Post, the New York Times are ostensibly national papers, but because they more and more have to cater to a narrow audience of the people who are willing to pay, the result is that they cater to those people's kind of ideological whims. And it's a vicious dynamic. The more they do it, the more they're expected to go along. And so a kind of narrowing, intellectual narrowing and lack of curiosity happens. So those are the dynamics that are driving the founding of something like Compact. And so I'll just lay out our concept. Ideologically, we thought there was a niche opportunity in the sense that we noticed online there were lots of conversations happening between people of left and right who used to disagree with each other ferociously, but now find themselves in a strange concord. And from a business point of view, we noticed, of course, that fracturing means lots of people are starting their own outlets. They're going on Substack. They're becoming individual brand journalists, and people are paying them $5 a month, $10 a month to subscribe to just that person. And so we saw this opportunity that, first of all, to institutionalize those interesting left-right conversations that are happening, and I'll give you an example in a second, to institutionalize them, to give them a home, and second of all, to bring some of the older values of the journalistic world to this new world of Substacks, et cetera, right? So not every thought that pops into the head of a journalist is actually worthwhile. So it still needs an editor to say, that's interesting, could you do a little more reporting? That's good, but we should put some guardrails around what you've said, because otherwise you're too wild, or you're not wild enough. But at any rate, an editorial function and high production values are still necessary. And so those are the two niches, both ideological and then in terms of format, that we try to reach with Compact. And to give an example of how all that comes together, I'll just name one of our writers named Thomas Fazzi. He's an Italian socialist, but wrote a piece for us headlined, "Why Brussels Hates Orban." And obviously, he doesn't necessarily substantively agree with the Orban government, but he's of the old type left that thinks that democratic majorities matter, that popular sovereignty matters, and against this kind of rule by expert consensus that's removed from the will of the people. And sort of whether it's to push free market ideology or to push gender ideology, it's not contestable in the democratic public square. It's not justiciable, it's just the experts say, and individual countries have to go along. So in defending that principle, he ends up defending the Polish and Hungarian, the current Polish and Hungarian governments. And that's the kind of thing we reach for, that we have, in this case, a left writer sort of counterintuitively coming to this conclusion.
Thank you.
So I hope, yeah, that's a good answer.
Thank you. Colin, could you follow up, please, on the business models? How are the business models changing? Because Sorab mentioned the Substack thing. We are getting moving away from the ad-based business model to a subscription-based business models. How are these changing at the moment?
Yes, I mean, I'd start out by saying I too came from a print background in newspapers and magazines for much more of my life than I've been in digital things, of course. I now publish this weekly newsletter, Flashes of Flames, which is essentially a 2,000-word essay from me every Friday morning, if you're so lucky. And what I do is try to observe the movement between, if you like, the legacy media and digital, and vice versa. And I think my overwhelming feeling, just before I really answer that question, is that there are just countless examples where advertising destroyed good business models in newspapers and magazines. And I say that because we all know newspapers and magazines that less than 20 years ago absolutely depended on advertising for most of their revenue and for their profit. And what that meant, in many cases, was that newspapers in particular would push any old fringe audience, push the circulation as far as they possibly could, because there was so much advertising around. It's a really profitable thing to do. An extra 1,000 copies gets you X thousand more advertising money, because there was an advertising boom underway, which roughly ran from the 60s to comparatively recently into the 21st century. And so what then happened, so I think that what had once been an ancillary revenue became a major revenue source and completely corrupted the relationship with readers. So cover prices were relatively low, because they would be, because you just want everybody to read it, because advertising is where the money's coming from. And so I think that that's, I believe, the context for what happened. And it meant that when the advertising went, these publications have become completely hooked on advertising. Advertising went online with Google and Facebook and so on. and suddenly readers who hadn't really been expected to pay a fair price for a copy were now being asked to pay a price, and so you get a huge amount of disruption. So that's my personal view based on a fair number of real examples, particularly in the UK. And I think that's, for me, the sort of the sobering line I like to take in this world, where this is the Industrial Revolution. The Brits referred to this phrase, the Industrial Revolution, in whatever it was, 17th or 18th century, when steam power came in and everything changed in manufacturing. And there are all kinds of bumpy, difficult times. It must have been a chaotic time, you can imagine, when that happened and when the whole world changed for hundreds of years afterwards. And so there are all kinds of things that may be temporary, may be transitional, may be just part of getting used to something. But fundamentally, there are very important changes that let us do more. And I think, so that's one thing. The second thing is that every example of every media history you've ever read is that media types don't tend to disappear. Invention tends to be accretive. And so if there's a new way of doing something tomorrow, it will take something from the existing, and perhaps quite a lot from the existing media, but they will coexist together. And so I think it's perfectly possible to say, well, print, it isn't a case of print dying. Print will be smaller and of a smaller business, but it will still be there. And I think the only other point I'd then add, just very quickly, I realize I'm pushing on time, is that, you know, what we're talking about isn't a debate, I believe, about whether it's a book and that exists, or a magazine and will that exist, and so on. We're talking about reading, listening, and viewing. And anything we say about whether a book is a great idea or a bad idea, or whether, you know, your 10-year-old nephews or children like books or whatever, that's a transitional issue. One of the things about online that we've all come to appreciate is how easily it's updated, how quickly it's transmitted, and how relatively cheaply it's produced. And those things will play on until, of course, there will be versions of books that are updated more or less as you read them, that you can fold up and put in your pocket more than you can with an iPad or a Kindle. And so quite a lot of this debate, I think, is all the change and getting used to the change. But I think it's absolutely essential for a large amount of media that it becomes dependent on the readers and responsive to readers. Advertising can be a valuable ancillary. If it again becomes 75% of something, then it's very difficult for the publisher to be in touch with the readers.
Rod, of course.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I too came up in the newspaper world. I entered newspapers in 1989, right after I graduated from college, and we had no idea that the transition that would be upon us within 10 years with the advent of the internet. And I don't think that the problem with the mainstream media, at least in the US, is strictly about ideology, but that's a big part of it. I grew up in a United States where there were only 3 television networks, and there were a few major newspapers. To use a Marxist term, the control of the means of media production was in the hands of a very small class. But they could trust, the people who ran the networks and who ran the newspapers could trust that the people who consumed their product, so to speak, had trust in them. I realized quickly as a conservative working in the mainstream media how insular the media were, not just the editors and the producers at the media outlets, but also the journalists. you know, it was such a joke to me that the whole idea of diversity training really took off a few years into my career, and how proud the people in newsrooms were, the bureaucrats, that look at all this diversity we have. Well, they had people of every racial background, men, women, gay, straight, etc., but they had all gone to the same colleges. They all had the same views on everything. One newspaper I was at, the only religious conservatives in the newsroom, aside from me, were the black Pentecostal secretaries. Everybody else was secular or maybe liberal in their religion. The point here is that the people in newsrooms lost faith with the people for whom they supposedly reported. I can remember being, I was at the Dallas Morning News for years, one of the major newspapers in America, and it was striking to me to be living there in probably the most conservative big city in the United States, and to realize that most of the people in our newsroom despised the worldview of our subscribers. I had seen, because I was a section editor, I had seen the internal research of the average Dallas Morning News reader. They were middle-aged, white, suburban Republicans. This was the perfect profile of the kind of person most people in our newsroom hated. This is not a surprise to any conservative who's in the media or who pays attention to the media. What was interesting to me, though, is the inability, or rather the unwillingness, of the people who ran these legacy media operations to recognize how precarious their situation was in terms of their readers. I mean, what business actually expects to succeed if it hates the people who buy its product? That is a big problem that we've had, and the internet has obviously done an enormous amount to democratize the media by revealing the prejudices, class prejudices, cultural prejudices, and so forth of the legacy media. The problem is so many of the legacy media are still older, and they were formed, as I was, and as certainly the baby boomers ahead of me were, by the idea that the news media are liberal in the sense of they're going to be fair and we're just reporting the facts, and B, worthy of trust. It still hasn't occurred to the people who run the mainstream organizations that those days are over.
Thank you. Before going to the politics-related questions, I would ask a midway question in this regard, regarding objectivity. Isn't it, Javier, isn't it market strategy of the publishers? So with objective and not partisan narrative, they can attract more readers, and that's why they can attract more demand. Was it just a marketing tool, let's put it this way, or does it have a intellectual sense also?
That's a nice question. I think objectivity is concept all media invited. When we studied in the university, they told us we are forced to work for democracy. We are democracy. There's no democracy with free press. We have to be objective. But as soon as you start working in media, you realize that objective probably is not the best word, but to be honest. I mean, you have to be honest as a journalist, and especially because at the very moment you start thinking about something, that's a subject, that's subjectivity. I mean, the way I express, the way I choose my words, the way I create the sentences, the way I explain, the way I write, is completely subjectivity. It's because it's my own way of expression. We have to ask for media to be honest, not to be objective. Everyone knows the editorial line of all media. We look at, we read, we watch, but from some years to today, to now, we've seen that, especially leftist media in Spain, I will put some examples in Spain because I think it's the best example to understand how it's going, at least in Europe, probably because I live from Spain. But if you check every media you can have, and you go to the leftist one, you see that it's completely invented. There's no relation between the fact, the actual fact, which is objectivity, to the way they express the idea. And I always remember my grandmother, the mother of my mother. She grew up during the Franco's regime. And when I started journalism, I asked her, I was like, Grandma, well, how do you do during Franco's to be informed? And she said, it's like, well, you know, kid, everyone knew what's going on. You just read between lines. And I think the problem nowadays is that most of the people think that as we are living in democracies, or supposed to be called democracies in some countries, information is perfect, information has no interest, information is just for public information, but without opinion, you know, without all the powers behind the media. We are called the fourth power, and sometimes I think we are the first one. We can, through governments, we can create governments, we can change people in companies, we can change the way you think, we can choose your reality. And I think that now people, thanks to some crisis, the economic crisis in 2008, and especially the one with the sanitary crisis with the coronavirus, people now realize that how much power we can have. And the problem I see is that all the reputation from mainstream media, well, a problem, let's put in a quote, all the reputation they had has gone. At least in Spain, almost nobody believed those people, those media. You can see all the comments, all the commentaries in web pages, in social media. They are always against the editorial line of these newspapers. And this factor is one of the key points that move us in 7 and 9 to create this media, to create this television. Because people are demanding new alternative information, new ways of approaching reality, new perspectives. And especially if you see the Spanish media, you have the feeling that they are treating you as an idiot, as someone you cannot understand the world as it happens unless they give you how to understand it. But then when you realize, of course, it's something not easy to do, especially because when you go to television, it's money, 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 money. And when you're fighting the big orgs we have, and especially when we were talking the first.
Are you in Mordor?
We live in Mordor, actually, in Spain especially. But for example, when we were talking in the first question about, in the presentations talking about how the media is in a strategic field. In Spain, we have 6 main channels. 2 of them are public, also controlled by the socialist government. Another 2 is controlled by a Spain media outlet, but leftist, center leftist, extreme left. And the other 2 are controlled by Berlusconi, by Italian media. None of them has different editorial lines. Probably the way they approach, this honesty I was talking about. But that's why we wanted to create this media. And you find people are demanding honest information. We don't lie. We are saying, hey, this is who we are, this is what we want to do, this is how we see things. And this is the information we give you, the analysis, the approaches. Yeah. And people like it because they know what they're saying. The problem is that when you're supposed to see objectivity and you're just watching propaganda. What they say that if you want news out someone don't want you to publish, the other things are public relations. And I think we are just going through this desert of nobody knows what's going to happen. We're talking about changing the foundation, with changing information technologies. It's quite difficult to see what's happening, but I can tell you in Spain that people like to be honest.
Yeah, but doesn't that raises a really interesting question. We talk about the authority of the news producers, of newspapers, digital sites, etc. But I think that there's also a real responsibility on the part of the news consumer to discern among the different messages that they hear. The thing that I worry about, even though I'm very happy that we have a time now where there's so many more diverse voices in the media, how can we determine when we are hearing something that's true versus something that only flatters our prejudices. Because as a conservative, I want to hear more conservative voices, but I also see on the conservative media side in the US, you see the role of bias too, where a lot of conservative, especially new media, they don't want to question their own biases too. They think it's simply enough to challenge the left, as opposed to being more honest and challenging their own biases.
Can I answer
Briefly.
briefly?
Sorry.
No, don't worry.
And we will pass the word to Zoltán after that.
Every time when I talk about this, I remember Giovanni Sartori, the Italian thinker, media thinker, and the word he invented, the infotainment. Before, a long time ago, when you study, you have to spend time. Education means time. Now people, I think, they don't want to spend that time. They want just to be entertained. Infotainment, information entertainment. And of course that changed our job, the way we work, especially when you know that, for example, in videos, we know that in television, people don't watch more than 1 minute. I mean, it's almost impossible to pay attention to videos of more than 1 minute. So it changes your job, it changes the way you work, the way you condense the information. So it's difficult to break that, especially in television. Probably not in magazines when you spend, you know, you are paying for something you want to read and spend that time reading. But in television, it's quite hard, it's very difficult.
The other side of the table is eager to say something.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting topic and a very interesting question. My experience is that right-wing people want to read right-wing things, opinions, articles, and left-wing people want to read left-wing opinions. That's the overwhelming majority, especially if they pay for it. A right-wing reader wants to buy and make an abo for a conservative magazine, a socialist for a socialist magazine, and so on and so on. So it's very nice to see, and we intellectuals often think that neutrality is very important, and people want to have it. But if you look on the portfolio, if I look on the Hungarian media market, the over 95% of the newspapers you can order into one direction or to the other, and I think it's not just because the editors want it, but the readers want to read it. Secondly, neutrality, I think, fairness is existing, but neutrality is not existing in a way how we think that there is only a fact and you can write a fact. It's just because we are humans. I see through my eyes, I speak with my mouth, it goes through my cells in my brain, and so on and so on. So it will be, even if I try to be fair and neutral, I try to do my best to achieve this goal. It will be through me. If you really look on the Hungarian media market, I think our media market is very, very different from the United States or the United Kingdom or larger European markets, because we are very small. Because the readership is only 10 million people, and there are countries here in the region, in Slovenia, for 2 million people and so on, which are much smaller media markets. A lot of free products are available, which is encouraging the media owners and the people that if you are paid for something, then it will be in your opinion. A right-wing reader will never pay or rarely pay for a left-wing journal.
I will pass the word to Sorab and after to Colin to reflect on these things.
Yeah, so I want to defend this tendency of having outlets that are that they are fair, that are honest, but aren't necessarily objective. And I'll tell you the difference. So in the United States, obviously our founding fathers thought that the free and open circulation of ideas through the press was so important that they not only created the First Amendment, which prevents government censorship of the press, but went so far as to legislate in the early republic that these types of media would get discounted postal service. And even when, if need be, when the fisc was under pressure, that they would subsidize the circulation of newspapers, magazines, etc., even at that meant charging more for other types of mail. But in that time, in the late 18th century and through the 19th century, the newspapers that were around were not the kind of authoritative, objective newspapers that those emerged in the 20th century. In the 19th century, each newspaper was owned by a different faction, sometimes local faction, sometimes national factions. The Jacksonians have their own papers, the Federalists have their papers, and of course, over time, through the experience of the 20th century, we've come to look down our noses at that model because in the 20th century, as these newspapers became less artisanal, they grew into these, they became less independent, they grew into these conglomerates, and at the same time, the progressive era was happening, and it set a standard for how newspapers should operate. Something was lost. This is an argument I borrow from this great historian, Christopher Lasch, who says something was lost in that model that prevailed in the 19th century, and that was this sense that you knew that information, of course, is always going through a medium. It's always going to be political. And in the 20th century model of like authoritative New York Times, you know, or 60 Minutes type kind of coverage, the problem with that was that, of course, the people who produce that they are a medium. They have their own biases. They are they form a class, but they passed on their own agenda as though it was the word of, you know, truth with a capital T itself. And so that model, as Rod said, as Sultan said, that model is kind of crashing up against the failures of itself. But what we should retain from that model, and here I'll defend all the old kind of mainstream media, is they still have that, there are still quality controls. When the New York Times writes a critical essay about me, nevertheless, someone other than the reporter will call me and say, you know, the reporter says that you said, is that quote accurate? And I'll say, well, yeah, but didn't quite capture the gist of what I was saying, all of that. And I worry, and I agree with Rod, that some of this sort of right-wing new media doesn't have any of that. You know, and any schmuck with an iPhone can create something and get enormous leverage, and they could be lying, or they could not have that professionalism. So what we need to cultivate is not necessarily that objective, authoritative, and maybe that will never come back. Maybe it was just a product of this 20th century. But some of the guardrails of traditional journalism, the fact-checking, the sort of quality prose, et cetera, that we can retain and that we should try to recover.
Colin?
Yeah, I'd sort of half agree, I think, with that, but half don't agree at all. I mean, there was clearly a time when to get your views heard by more than just your family and friends, you had to own a printing press. You had to be very rich. And then you could run a newspaper, and then you could push your views out. About 100 years ago, Randolph Hearst, well-known propagandist newspaper proprietor, said he saw his job as not reporting news, but making news. And he invented what people variously call the yellow press, gutter press, or popular newspapers. The fact is, for all these years, there have been big-time proprietors pushing, and we know the names of them currently, pushing their points of view. There are some brilliant newspapers who do a lot of fact-checking and are as objective as they reasonably can be. But actually, there's a lot of propaganda. And the propaganda element, if you like, the fixed view, the echo chamber, is amplified now by the democratization of media. So how terrible it is that there's a lot more awful channels and unobjective channels of news now than there was. But there's a lot less strength in the hands of the proprietors who once controlled all of it.
Thank you, and I think it can be followed with the gatekeeper function of the media. Balázs Orbán stated the sovereignty phenomenon, how media is important in a nation's life with respect to sovereignty, and I think it's somehow connected to the gatekeeper function. So in the past, editors and publishers could decide what kind of content does the population consume, but now it's also changing with the democratization of the media. Rod, can you share your remarks on this?
Yeah. I used to explain to people when I would go speak to conservative audiences in the US, I would say the media's left-wing bias does not express itself with liberal editors and writers telling people what to believe. Its bias is more insidious than that. It expresses itself by forming the framework for what we can talk about. I'll give you an example. Back around the year 2006, 2007, in the US, we were starting to talk about same-sex marriage. And I remember having a conversation in the Dallas Morning News newsroom. Again, this was in a very conservative part of America. I remember having a conversation with a young guy there, also a conservative. I said, our newspaper, we don't report fairly at all on this issue. You never hear the side of traditionalists who are against same-sex marriage. They might as well not exist in our newspaper. My younger colleague, though he was a conservative, said, well, of course not. Do you think that during the civil rights era, for racial civil rights in America, do you think this paper would have an obligation to report fairly on the opinions of the Ku Klux Klan? Now that really shocked me, because here was a guy who was not much younger than I am, thinking that the people, Christians and other social conservatives who believe in traditional marriage were the equivalent of the Ku Klux Klan. Now that opinion was widely shared in the newsroom. Nobody saw anything wrong with it. So these were the gatekeepers, right? They were the ones who kept out anything contrary to the pro-LGBT narrative. That happens all the time. It is much less powerful today, thank God. Nevertheless, in my country at least, and I'd be interested to know what Sorop thinks of this, it is still the case that the New York Times, the Washington Post, and a handful of other media sources do control the narrative. And I think that many of us on the right, though, as happy as we are to have Fox News and any number of smaller news sources, we would trade it all if we could have the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, because those organizations, even though they are weaker than they were in the past, they still shape the narrative in a dominant way, in part because they speak to the elites, the political elites, the academic elites, and the professional elites.
But I think it's basically when misusing of such words like gatekeeper function, it's the misusing of fact-checking function. If the gatekeeper function is that we keep out other opinions, that's not a gatekeeper, it's an ideology keeper. If we, through fact-checking, say, look, here is something, but the source is not good, but you can't say why this source is not good, it's just not good, then it's not a fact-checking function, it's just through your ideology or through your imagination or and your opinion, you try to select things that are then somehow resulting the result that you want to have. But it's really misusing of these things, and that's probably now the big problem with these fact-checking sites and with the gatekeeper function as well, that it is misused and not used in its own sense.
Javier?
Yes. About what you said before, I think I'm the only weirdo here that also read leftist media. I don't pay for them, but it's nice.
I do pay for them.
I pay for it. It's nice to read them because we know how they think. So we know how can we fight them. But we're talking about, you get the point. It's about framing. And I think also two examples in Spain. A few months ago, a French investor wanted to buy Prisa, which is the main left-wing media outlet. They have a lot of publishing companies and television, radio. Is the main leftist media. I mean, when you think about something in Spain, it's Prisa. And that French guy wanted to move the editorial line a little bit to the right, let's say center. So the government came and blocked that operation because that's a strategic company for them, for leftist media. So that's the way they frame to the voters what they want to think. That's one example. The other one was about, for example, LGTB ideology, gender ideology. Every time you want to counter back, to give counter information, as they control all these media, they know how to revert it and sell it as a victory. And especially about talking with these fact checkers. For example, also two in Spain, Neutral and Maldita.es. Neutral, for example, is part of IFN, the International Fact-Checking Network, which is owned by Poynter Institute, which is funded by Open Society Foundation, Google, Facebook, and so on. And the other one is Maldita, who is also funded by this kind of foundations. And those fact-checkers during the pandemic, as soon as the pandemic started, at least in Spain, they said, don't believe anyone else, just believe the government. So you have fact-checkers, who are supposed to be goalkeepers, saying, hey, don't listen to anyone else but the government. So you see how this works, and this is why I said before, that people start to realize how it is working. And I think it's important because, at least in the left-wing politicians lost the mind control of the population. And they saw the way to act in a conservative way. I know we always say, we are not like them, we don't want to do that, but that works. And maybe we have to think about new ways of controlling, and don't misunderstand me, people in the way that how can information can affect politics in somehow.
Sorab? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just to add another wrinkle, not to solve anything that's been raised, these are all good points, but at least in the United States, and I think in parts of Western Europe, another problem has been the destruction, the decimation of local news, which should concern people of whatever background, because people who are up on their local news, just what's happening in the city council, in what's happening in your local government, sewage, etc. Also, studies show they tend to be more active voters, they're better small d democratic citizens, and the decimation of that, and I think it's not unrelated to the sort of hyper-ideologization of the national media and the oversized role that they now play, is partly the loss of local news. And that's happened as a result of political, economic, market developments, which policy needs to counter. What I mean by that is that local news, it wasn't just that, they weren't prepared for the internet to come along and advertising revenues suddenly collapsed and they were left sort of hanging dry. That's part of the story. But it's also partly the monopolistic behavior of the tech giants, right? The reason local news is eroded is because local newspapers now have to compete with Facebook, Google, etc. as advertisers, right? Because you compete with them because those are platforms for advertising, but you also have to compete with them as content providers because they've set up their websites in such a way that they take your news as you're the content provider, they take it, they present it, but you never have to leave their platform. Your entire experience is structured on Facebook, Twitter, Google. And so the local outlet, or even the national or international outlet, loses out on the subscribers, it loses out on the eyeballs. And so this requires a policy kind of antitrust response, which is happening in Australia, which is happening, the European Union and Canada are talking about it, basically forcing these giants to sort of pay up for the content that they use. Unfortunately, and I think similar legislation is moving forward at the EU level. It is not happening in the United States, despite all the sort of grumbling of our conservatives about big tech and the liberal Silicon Valley, et cetera. When it comes down to it, they're dogmatic free marketeers and aren't prepared to take the policy steps necessary to shore up local news. Local news with journalists who are part of the community, they know their community, and have the sort of old school journalistic values are a great bulwark against nationalization of every issue. If I look at every election as a national election, I'm voting for my city council. What really matters here is schools, garbage collection, crime, but I don't care about that. I just look at like big hot button national issues and I vote down the line. I am not a good citizen, my local community suffers, and I end up electing people who may not even be, for whatever their party. So this takes a policy response, and I look forward, if we can talk about this kind of thing in other sessions, is the political economy of tech and media.
You're right about that, Sorab, but I think there's another wrinkle too. Again, when I was at the Dallas Morning News in the first decade of this century, some of the people in the newsroom saw that this was a problem, and they saw that the subscribers of the paper lived in the prosperous suburbs of the city. So they shifted news gathering around to put emphasis on covering local issues in the suburbs. They could not get reporters in the newsroom, especially younger reporters, to do this. Everybody was bored by going to the suburb to cover the sewer board meeting and the this and the that. The ambitious reporters, the best reporters, wanted to be downtown at City Hall or go into the state legislature. And I saw what happened there was that the sort of media ecology that had arisen in an era of where you could make yourself a star journalist by establishing a brand on social media and elsewhere, made it less likely that an ambitious reporter would want to do the hard, boring work of covering local journalism. So younger people, especially in the digital era, could come into a newsroom and they could see there was no future for them in the media long term in becoming good local journalists. They were incentivized by the media ecology. This is something that newspapers don't have any control over, but they were incentivized to go for the hot issues, the ideological issues, the political issues at a high level. Similarly, I remember talking to my mom, who lives in a small town in Louisiana. I was asking her once, not long ago, about a local election. And she said, "We don't talk about politics anymore." I said, "Well, I understand Republican, Democrat, but this is a local election." She told me that things had become so heated politically that the national anger that people have and mistrust over politics had sunk down to the local level where people are afraid to talk at all about politics in any sense because they don't want to fight. And I think that's something that affects the way we report and think about media.
Thank you, Javier. And after Q&A.
We have to think the information structure as a triangle, and we need, first of all, we need conservative press agencies. That's the first of all. We have a lot of magazines, we have a lot of think tanks, we have a lot of media, we have a lot of social media, whatever. But we don't have conservative press agencies. And that's the first part of the triangle, of the pyramid. Once you have that conservative press agency, then you have media that is producing new information or new commentaries with that previous information, and will go to the rest of the society. The main press agencies in the world are centers at the left, most of them. Most are Anglo-Saxon or English biased, French, and even the Spanish one is owned by the state also. So every time the government changes the editorial line from this press agency. So I think we start to create these conservative press agencies to start changing. First you start information, according to what you said, that will be local, regional, national news, and you will have a journalist everywhere around to produce information according to what your, of course, in this case also too, bias is.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to the questions from the audience. I think I have one which is pretty good. Will the shift to the subscription model favor the right or the left? Will it allow conservative media to rival the influence of the mainstream media? So this subscription-based thing, which side of the political narrative is favored?
So I guess I'll just take that as someone who's doing that. Compactmag.com, write about 10 euros a month if you want to. So obviously we publish writers of left and right. I think it will favor, at its best, it will favor voice. I hate to use the word dissident because it makes it sound like we're living in communist Czechoslovakia or something.
You can call alternative.
But voices that should be heard and will find an audience and are finding an audience, and at their very best, they begin to even alter or at least marginally affect conversations that happen happen in the mainstream. So I don't think that's yeah. I mean, I'm a little bit wary of saying it, you know, it's a right-wing phenomenon or a left-wing phenomenon, or it'll redound to the benefit of one or the other. I think at its best, it will redound to the benefit of, you know, kind of counter-institutional forces generally.
Thank you. Others?
If you look on the Hungarian media market, I think the subscription model only works in very special cases. In serious political media, in my opinion, it is working very, very hardly, especially in online, because in Hungary we have a lot of I think a very strong media pluralism, very diverse and very pluralistic, but very harsh opinions. So you can't find, as I described you, just one or two who I would say neutral. All the others are right, conservative, or left. And you have a choice. And let's say one player is deciding that they are building a paywall. Then the readers will have the choice from several other options to choose an alternative which is free. So on the online media, on such a small media market like the Hungarian one, it will be very difficult. And on the other hand, the advertisement market is also very difficult. Now Google and Facebook are cashing basically more than 50% of all the online advertisement budget in the country. It's about 56%. And only 44% of all online media budget is going to all the media.
But isn't the long format journalism is the solution? So content or articles which have more added value, and that's why people are eager to pay for them. Colin?
Yes, I mean, I think the first thing to say is there's a lot more choice in all kinds of ways than there ever was before digital, because you don't need money to have a media outlet. So there just is more choice, and that means there's more bad stuff, there's more good stuff, in my view, and more well-done stuff, and so on. I think the other trend in certainly the States and the UK is that people are showing that they are more prepared to pay for content than they used to be, which sounds to me like a good idea. And one of my personal sort of hobby horses is that the reason why newspapers are as they are, a big, bulky thing full of different sections and so on, is because that's the manufacturing process of print. You know, you can't just print a 2-page something. You have to, for the economics of it, you produce some big newspaper. When it comes to digital, how many newspapers in their digital guises where they could sell you just one section of the newspaper rather than all the rest of the stuff you don't want, how many newspapers will do that for you, even though digitally they can? And the reason why they won't is because the economics of print still helps many of them generate the profits they've got. They're hanging on to the past. So this is this strange period of time when things are not quite, for a lot of players, are not quite as new as they seem. But I think the best thing about it is that there's just more and more going on. My little business of less than 2,000 subscribers, 2 years old, people paying £100 plus a year, sort of proves to me that, well, people are prepared to pay for that. I'm not replacing something else. I've come along, I'm doing something that those people are happy to pay for, but I'm not the only one. I mean, there's a magazine in the States called The Atlantic Monthly, as was, proving the point. New York Times has more subscribers now in all kinds of ways than it ever had in the past. So I think that, you know, I'd love to leave the message that media is in a much better place because there is more choice, and there's potentially even more choice and more invention and less control by powerful forces than in the past.
Rod?
Yeah, I'm diversified in the media I produce. I work for a magazine, but I also have a Substack that I reserve to write only about spiritual and religious issues, things that would not really go on my blog at the American Conservative. And I've got about 1,500 subscribers there. A relatively small number, but it's enough to make a good living on. And I think what those people like is a voice, they're responding to a voice that they can't get anywhere else in the free media. I think the Substack revolution has been one of the best things to happen to journalism. Barry Weiss, who had one of the best jobs in journalism, she was on the editorial board of the New York Times. In traditional journalism terms, that's the peak. But she quit 2 or 3 years ago because even though she's on the left herself, on the center left, she refused to live by the lies that ruled that ideologically driven newsroom, the wokeness. She started her own Substack, and now it has really boomed because she draws writers from the right and the left who are interested in exploring things from a more honest, truthful way. I think this has been fantastic. But you've got to be willing to pay for this sort of thing. And I think people, not the mass audience, but there are enough people who value a unique voice or unique voices and voices that are willing not to take one strict political line, unbending political line, but to rather to tell the truth. And this is a good thing.
I think we will have a final question here. And the main question is that a publication or a publisher or editors, which side of the market should they choose? So the question says, doesn't catering the audiences undermine the whole point of journalism, or is it is it in a sense better than having to align with companies for ad revenue? So should the publishing companies serve the readers or the advertisers?
I mean, always the traditional answer has been you serve the readers. You don't even serve the writer as a publisher or editor. Ultimately, the writer is a servant of the reader, just like the outlet is ideally. So Compact, we don't have advertising because we rely on the subscription revenue. You would think that mainstream outlets that do rely on advertising still try to look beyond that, right? And that does create hairy situations where, your advertiser is someone that you also cover, for example, right? A particular advertiser is a subject of news. But there are guardrails set up to try to, so often, not just with like an episode like that where there is a conflict of interest between what appears in the paper's editorial or news section and what's in the ad section, so often, it can be resolved, that kind of conflict, or other issues where journalists make famously sort of ideological mistakes. So I'm veering off the question of just advertisers, but famously in the United States, infamously, there was this story, Rod knows it well, of these high school kids who were at an anti-abortion march, and they were confronted by this old man who happened to be Native American, and it was sort of a 90-second YouTube of it was captured, and the framing of mainstream outlets, which subsequently got sued, was that these young high school students who were pro-Trump and anti-abortion were harassing this Native American man. But then once the full footage appeared, it was clear that it was just the exact opposite, that they were trying to keep calm and he kept sort of getting in their faces. Ultimately, many outlets have to settle with the plaintiff in that case. Now, why do I mention this kind of episode or the advertising is in each of these cases, if the traditional media just follow the old school guidelines of, if you accuse someone of something, make sure you hear their side of the story because it might complicate your narrative. Or if you're dealing with an advertiser, how do you create a firewall between your editorial product and the advertising? In each of these cases, the most embarrassing cases would be resolved if just the old school rules were adhered to. But the bottom line is, no, we have to serve the reader, and that's something that puts this industry in the strategic category, as Balázs said, because there's democracy at stake, there's sovereignty at stake, there's the common good at stake.
That's a tricky question. I think the solution could be in the middle. And I mean, I thank God I've been lucky because I've never been cancelled by any of my employers. They believe in me, they believe in my expertise, so I thank God for that. But every time you go to the press conference, at least in Spain, and there's political scandals. And of course, I mean, everyone knows what questions do you have to raise. But then the rest of the media doesn't ask those questions. They don't want to bother the politicians because those politicians are in a good relations with the media, so they don't want to bother the, in case something happened. Or maybe they are fired, and that's the problem. And I don't agree with, I do agree we have more media than before, but they are owned by less people. In America, 80% are controlled by 5 to 7 companies. And they own Disney, they own Fox, they own, there's no diversity over there. Of course, not in Spain too. So new journalists, or even old journalists, they feel forced. They cancel themselves before someone says them. So it's difficult, and according to other questions, that what is the new journalist or what a journalist is difficult. We have now more loudspeakers than journalists, and I think it's a pity to find that when you're working.
The question, should newspapers, should media serve the audience or advertisers, is a complex one, because it can presume, if we say the media should serve the readers, as I think it's clear that it should, it's not a one-way communication. It's not the case that the journalist should ask the reader, what should we write about, what should we broadcast, or that the media should say to the reader, here's what you must believe and must read. There needs to be some sort of relationship there, reciprocal relationship. I know from my own experience in American mainstream media, there is a very strong priestly, clerical attitude on the part of people in the newsrooms that we know what you reader need to know and what you need to think, and so sit back and let us tell you about it. That's wrong, and that arrogance is hurting them, hurting their business bottom line. On the other hand, there is a responsibility on the part of readers to give the writer or the broadcaster, the journalist, give them space to be able to tell the reader, the viewer, something that he or she may not want to hear, but that is important. You can only get that when you have developed a relationship of trust, where it's not just a strictly marketized consumer experience, but it's really one that's more of a human thing. I can't find the words to articulate it, but I know that there are writers, I generally don't trust the New York Times, but there are writers I trust there. And because they have shown, or certain journalists at other outlets have shown that they are worthy of trust. It doesn't matter if I agree with them politically or culturally. It's that I know that they aren't trying to sell me a particular party line.
Thank you very much, and I will wrap up the discussion. Thank you all for having or for being here, and for the audience.
Thanks
also.
To you.
Thank you, and please be with us in these 2 days. There will be very nice discussions to catch, and thank you all. Thanks.